Hakes, and I am a member of the Cook County Higher Board. And on behalf of the Cook County Higher Board, Cook County Higher Education Board, and staff, I want to welcome you to our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Strategic Planning Session. Good morning, Who's Who, Miigwech, and thank you for joining us today. We value you and we value your input. I would now like to introduce another board member, Paula Marie Powell.
Hi all, hopefully you can hear me all right. I was having technical difficulties earlier. Before any of our programs or meetings, we read a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to do that now. Cook County Higher Education acknowledges that we are located on traditional, ancestral, and modern day lands of Indigenous people. These lands were stolen by white settlers who forcibly pushed out Indigenous people. Despite attempts at erasure, the Ojibwe Nation, and before them the Dakota and the Cree Nations, and other Indigenous peoples from time immemorial have persisted. While it is important to speak about and acknowledge the reality of our history, it's equally important to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and cultures thrive today. We recognize that this land acknowledgement is but one step in unmasking systems of oppression. We commit to the ongoing work of dismantling racist structures, particularly within the educational system, through learning opportunities for ourselves and for the community.
Thank you so much, Paula. I really appreciate that. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm super excited for the day. My name is Ann Phibbs. I use she, her pronouns. I am the founder and president of Strategic Diversity Initiatives, and I am the DEIA consultant for Cook County Higher Education. So I think I'm the only person who's not up there on the North Shore enjoying the cool. But I love the North Shore, I love Minnesota. And by way of just a little bit of background about me before I jump into the first part of the day, which is going to be the workshop I'm delivering. I moved to Minnesota, Minneapolis 32 years ago. So my joke is that I'm a newcomer because like once you get to Minnesota, you realize people are here forever. But I moved here to get a PhD in philosophy and feminist studies at the U of M Twin Cities campus. And I fell in love with the state, decided to stay. I've raised 3 kids here, 2 grown kids, and I have a 6.5-year-old now. And I've done a lot of work in higher education. So I identify as lesbian or queer. I was the first ever GLBT student services director at Metro State University in St. Paul, way back in the 90s, kind of proud of that. Went over, did similar LGBTQIA work at the University of Minnesota, and then wound up as their first ever director of education in the Office for Equity and Diversity. So I've done a lot of work around education and teaching and training around DEI, DEIA. You'll probably hear me say DEI a little bit. I don't add the A, although a lot of people are adding A, some people are adding B for belonging. So if you see me switch back and forth, you'll forgive me. But Cook County Higher Education has A for accessibility, which is great. And I will just share that 4 years ago, I started my own company, Strategic Diversity Initiatives, and now I work with nonprofits, corporate, higher ed, K-12, anyone who has me who wants to talk about these types of things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And one thing I will share is that while I'm delivering training, I tend not to look at the chat, but Kelsey will be doing that. And I just want to thank all of the staff and all of the folks who have been working with me, Sue and Paula, as well as the staff who have been part of this kind of committee putting this together. It's just been super helpful. So I'll go ahead and share my PowerPoint, and you have access to the PowerPoint because I want you to have access to it. Let me just put it in slideshow mode real quick. There we go. So this is our strategic planning day, and we just went through our virtual coffee hour. We're now going to go through my foundational workshop, Beyond Diversity 101, partly just to offer that as an educational tool for all of you who are here. Also because the work we're going to do in the afternoon, which I recognize not everyone will be able to stay, but I will share that everyone will be able, who's here right now, will have an opportunity to weigh in on the plan. Even if you can't create the plan in the afternoon, you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on it after I develop a draft. So in that respect, because we're doing the strategic planning together, we'll want to have some shared language and some shared understanding. So that's the way the day's going to go. And clearly there's a lunch break in between. And so here's the land acknowledgement that Paula just read for us. So I probably should have had that up when she was reading it. And so my apologies for that. But I think it's wonderful that that Cook County Higher Education does this land acknowledgement, and we're seeing a lot more people recognizing the need to pay attention to where we are embodied and the history of that, and often the history of oppression. And we'll be talking about that as we move into this workshop. Let me just say this: if at any point during the workshop you want to unmute yourself and raise a question, please, by all means, do that. You can also put it in the chat. I won't see it in the chat until I put you in small groups, but Kelsey can always, you can put something in the chat and Kelsey can read it if it seems relevant. The other thing is, feel free to put, a lot of times, you know, I'm not the only one who knows this stuff at all. So people often put resources, books or videos or TED Talks or things that they've learned from or organizations into the chat. And because we'll be capturing the chat and you can have access to that, that will be really wonderful. So please share your resources as we move through. So here's how I approach this work. And let me just say this: I do know that I use a lot of words on my slides. And, you know, I used to kind of make a joke about it, you know, that I'm a philosopher, I love words, and, you know, and I'm breaking this #1 rule of PowerPoint, but I've decided to kind of embrace it a little bit more instead of just kind of apologizing. I do want to give you more rather than less. I think there is a lot to learn around this. I want you to have a resource, something you can take back. And I will read some of the slides, which some people get very annoyed. It's actually a good, I won't read all of them, but reading more of them rather than less is good for accessibility purposes. So just to put that out there, I don't want to give you a slide with just like 3 words and you have to take notes. I'd rather just let this all wash over you. So here's how I approach the work, because not everyone approaches it in the same way. I do think we really need to know our history and context of the land we're on, of the people that we live and work amongst, of the laws and policies that have created, in many ways, unjust systems around all sorts of social identities. But at the end of the day, it's not just about knowledge. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's also very much a relational activity. We do this in community with each other. And I think that means we build this kind of community to do this work. I think that involves building trust through careful listening, respectful disagreement, and taking risks. So I always say, you don't have to agree with everything I say or anything I say for that matter. We can be in respectful disagreement. We're not seeing that modeled in our social and political life very much, especially with the advent of social media and what we've just been through with this recent election last fall. I mean, it's a tough time in that respect. I think that means it's even more important in our workplaces, in our organizations, and in our communities that we commit to that kind of respectful disagreement. But I also think this work is about taking risks. Sometimes they're emotional risks and sometimes they're intellectual risks, entertaining things that might not seem true, but just letting, you know, taking in some information and working with it. I think we're doing the best we can. Growth and learning can be uncomfortable. It's okay to make mistakes. I always say the goal of this work, and this is going to be whatever the work is, including our strategic planning, it will not be to be perfect. It's not perfection. We can never achieve perfection. It's to be intentional and deliberate. That's the goal of this work. So that when someone says, why does Cook County Higher Education do something this way? You don't want to say, well, I don't know, we've always done it that way. You want to be really intentional and say, we thought about it. We came up with this process, this procedure. This is how, you know, this is how we do outreach in the community, whatever it is. Again, it won't be perfect, but we will have set that intention as we were doing earlier. I do believe individuals and organizations can and do grow and change. It doesn't happen overnight. This really is lifelong work. And I believe also every person's capable of moving equity and diversity forward. It's always about both our social identity and our personal value. Personal values. So let's take the first part of that clause, social identities. We all have personal identities. You know, we might be an artist, an athlete, a parent, you know, someone who loves the out of doors, right? A nature lover. These are personal things that make us who we are, but we also, all of us have identities that are acted on by social forces. by race, by gender, sexual orientation, disability, class, age, religion, nationality. And the thing about social identities are that they're often related to oppressive structures, so that there are those of us who have privileged identities and marginalized identities. And when we have privilege, we often don't see it. It's kind of designed not to be seen. So I identify as white. I believe I have white privilege, don't want it, wish it wasn't there, but it doesn't make it go away, that I move through the world differently than Black, Indigenous, people of color. And that my racial identity actually impacts every part of my life. But here's the thing, we often don't think of it that way. For example, I will likely never be accused of playing the race card. We don't say that about white people, do we? And yet white people have a racial identity that profoundly impacts them. It just impacts them in a positive way. So we say that people of color, we kind of accuse them of playing the race card. We think when someone who's Native or person of color walks in the room, they brought race in the room. But in fact, a room full of white people has race in the room. And let's take gender. If I said, well, I'm glad you didn't go to the big gender conference that's also on Zoom. Honestly, how many of you would think they were talking about men? We hear the word gender, we think women, and yet men have a gender identity that profoundly impacts how they move through the world, just in a positive way. My last example is from my own life. I like to tell stories when I train. So I identify, as I mentioned, as lesbian. I say queer, not everyone does, but I do. And I have these 3 kiddos. Well, my son, I can't believe it, next month is about to turn 30 years old. But when he was in elementary school, my then partner, Deb, and I'm gonna go ahead and mute everyone, just because I'm getting some feedback. Okay, thanks everybody. So we went up to one of those fairs in the Twin Cities where you're like talking to school, like teachers and principals to find out where you might want to go to school. So we walked up to this table and I said, oh, this is my partner Deb, this is our son Dylan, and this I said, so we're 2 lesbian moms, and this principal looked at me and said, well, our school doesn't have an agenda around sexual orientation. And I said, well, I don't have an agenda. I mean, I have a child who's being raised in a non-traditional family structure, and I certainly would like him to be well cared for. Needless to say, I didn't go to that school. But I bet if my twin sister had walked up, also 2 kids, but married to a man, highly doubtful she would ever be accused of having an agenda, right? So her sexual orientation profoundly impacts her life, but she doesn't have to think about it. It's just normal. Whereas my sexual orientation and the fact that I have a marginalized identity has profoundly impacted me. So the point is, though, that it's not just those social identities, it's that what we do with them. That's the second part of that clause, and personal values. So we might have a lot of privilege. I identify as white, I identify as middle class, I grew up speaking English. Those are all ways I've been privileged, but I get to decide every day, here comes the agency, the personal values. What am I going to do to be actively anti-racist, to work against classism, to work against bias? And finally, I believe there's no silver bullet. We don't have to fix everything immediately. That'll be really important in strategic planning. We don't have to have a strategic plan that fixes absolutely everything, because there just isn't enough time and energy in the world for that. We can do it in a way that's strategic and sustainable and take care of ourselves. So what am I going to do in this training? Well, you've been warned, so get the coffee, as Sue said, or whatever it is. I'm gonna build a frame for you. So I'm gonna continue talking at you a little bit. And I wanna build a frame into which you bring your context from whatever it is you do in your life, whether it's paid work or volunteer work or just whatever kind of work it is for you, and in relation to your relationship to CCHE. So I want you to bring your context, but we're going to talk about diversity. We're going to talk about equity, and how those are 2 different things. We can have very diverse spaces that are not equitable. And I've described too many parts of the United States where that is true. So they're separate. We need both. And I'll talk about diversity and then loop back around to equity. But in between, I'm going to talk about how our social landscape is changing, specifically around disability and mental health and mental illness, around gender identity, and around race. And then I'm going to kind of narrow in on how does this play out in our organizations. I'm going to talk about microaggressions and micro inequities, and that'll be your first small group discussion. Then we'll talk about implicit bias or unconscious bias. I have a short video that I show. I'll share some of the research about that. And then we'll move from that into, okay, what do we do about it, right? So what does it mean to be an ally, a champion, an advocate, an accomplice, a co-conspirator, there's always a new word, but I'll talk about what that concept is. We'll have some scenarios, and then we'll wrap up with some next steps. So lots to do. And again, jump in if you have questions or comments. So this is just the slide that points out that there's a lot of research that shows that we want diverse teams in our work. And not just diverse teams in terms of people's approach. You know, we don't just want like the artist and the attorney and the mechanic and the teacher working on a problem, because they approach things differently. We actually get better outcomes when we have social diversity around social identity as well. So this is an article by Catherine Phillips in Scientific American, where she kind of says it all in the title: how diversity makes us smarter. Being around people who are different from us makes us more creative, more diligent, and harder working. And so she fills this article with lots of research that shows that, again, diverse teams get us better outcomes. So global banks, when they have racial and gender diversity at the very top, as opposed to more homogenous organizational leadership, get better outcomes. And she says simply interacting with individuals who are different forces group members to prepare better, to anticipate alternative viewpoints, and to expect that reaching consensus will take effort. So it's not just that someone brings a different viewpoint, it's that you act differently when you're with people who don't think exactly like you, that you're prepared, you're more focused. You, again, kind of, I like to think of it as, I worked at the U of M. You don't work in higher ed and not have lots and lots of meetings and teams. And if I went into a meeting where I kind of felt like everyone felt or thought just like me, I wouldn't really have to bring my A game. I wouldn't have to prepare as much. But if I knew I might get pushback, I knew someone was in that meeting who didn't see things exactly the way I did, I'd probably be more likely to be prepared. And so trust me when I say there's a lot of research that we want diversity, we want diverse teams. But again, we can have that diversity without equity. So I'll loop back around, as I said, to equity in a moment to point out what that means and why we need to address it. But I'm going to start with this, this first slide about kind of how our landscape's changing. So this is an article from CNN Business. More people with disabilities are getting jobs. My guess is you know very well that people with disabilities are much more likely, I should say, to be unemployed or underemployed compared to people without disabilities. In fact, only 40% of adults with disabilities in their prime working years have a job, compared to almost double that, 79% of all prime age adults. And so we know that first and foremost, a job gives you economic security. That's a good reason to get people with disabilities into the workplace, to increase their just their standard of living, their economic status. But we kind of forget that workplaces also give us a ready-made community. You don't have to be best friends with everyone you work with, most of us aren't, to still feel like those people care about you. They're going to notice if you're having a hard time. Or in this case, I'll share a story. I was on a Zoom call with a small company. I was doing a training. And before the training, we were, just chatting. And this woman had just had a baby. The baby was 1 month old. But because it was Zoom, she could take the baby out and show it to her colleagues. And it was really touching to see how excited her colleagues were to see this, new addition to her family. And it just reminded me of that there's a kind of social safety net, a kind of care that comes from the workplace. And when you think of for people with disabilities, social isolation is a big problem. So that's another reason, on top of economic stability, is that social safety net, that sense of building that community. So there has been a big push to get people with disabilities into the workplace. Now, if you're like me, when you hear the word disability, you might be a little inclined to go to an image of someone who uses a wheelchair, someone who's blind or low vision, deaf or hard of hearing. These are kind of our standard images. And yet the majority of people you ever meet, you ever encounter who have a disability, you'll never know it, because most people with disabilities, it's non-apparent or invisible. And according to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 1 in 5 Americans, 20%, that is millions and millions of people, live with a mental health condition or mental illness. Now, I've had the good fortune of listening to Sue Abderhold, and some of you may know her. She's the Minnesota chapter of NAMI, the executive director of the Minnesota chapter of NAMI. And I've heard her a number of times. And this was back pre-COVID, when you could visit people in the hospital. She would say, you got a friend who broke their leg or is fighting cancer, they're in the hospital, what do? She says, you send a card, you send flowers, maybe you go visit. So now you have a different friend, same hospital, just the psychiatric unit. Your friend is struggling with anxiety and depression. And Sue says, do you send a card? Do you send flowers? Do you go visit? She says, I know you don't, because I talk to the people who were in the psychiatric unit, right? Those are the people that I work with. They don't get cards or flowers very much, or visitors. We don't talk about it. Tremendous amount of stigma still to this day around mental illness. So I came out to you as lesbian or queer. I'm almost 59, 58 years old. Came out when I was 17, so 41 years ago. It was 1980. It was 11 years after the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City that started the gay pride movement, which is why Pride is in June. If you don't know that, all the Pride celebrations are usually in June. I think you have one up north in Duluth that is like in September, but a lot of them are held in June because of the Stonewall Rebellion. But when I came out in 1980, there's no gay straight alliance, there's no internet, right? And yet I've spent 32 years or 41 years or whatever it is, it's 41 years, being out, being open. Much harder for me to tell people I have OCD. I don't like to even say the words. Obsessive compulsive disorder kind of tugs on me. I was training and I said, oh, I take a small amount of medication every morning to manage it. And this woman came up to me after the training. Said, did you notice you had to tell us it was a small amount of medication? As if you'd said, I take a large amount of medication, that would be a bad thing. And I said, yeah, I think that's that stigma. It still tugs. So here's the good news. People are pushing back. They're saying, look, whether you're fighting cancer, broke your leg, living with bipolar disorder, struggling with depression, these are all medical conditions and everyone deserves support. So we need to stop with the stigma that says mental illness is somehow different than other kinds of diseases and conditions that people live with. And we need to be comfortable and open and out. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. There's even a campaign, #CureStigma. So I think we've always worked with and among people with disabilities, including with and among people who have mental illness. But I think people are going to be more out about it. We're going to talk about it more. Even the kind of table that is DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, access. In many ways, disability has kind of come late to that table. We've often talked about disability through a lens of compliance and accommodation, instead of through a lens of justice and challenging ableism and realizing that the ADA isn't going to cure everything in terms of attitudinal bias. And so in that respect, I think we're going to see more and more people talking about disability in general, about mental illness and mental health conditions in particular. So that's one change. We are also changing, and I'm going to argue kind of radically, around gender and gender identity. So 13 states now allow you to go back to amend your birth certificate to replace this binary designation, right? So our system of gender is one that is binary too. It's essential. It says you were born this way, and it's immutable. It doesn't change, right? That's the standard way that we understand gender. And so we look at, we put people into one of those two categories. Well, now 13 states are saying you can go back to your birth certificate and put something other than male or female, maybe an X for non-binary. I will tell you that a year ago, that was 6 states. So it has more than doubled in the space of a year. It is changing quickly. Now, a lot of us know something about trans identity, transgender identity. I'm going to use my friend Anne as an example. Anne is a trans activist here in the Twin Cities. She's just an amazing person, a good friend of mine, a little bit older than me. When Anne was born, Anne was assigned male at birth. Now, why do I say it that way, assigned male at birth? Because we don't know what a baby thinks about their gender identity. We can't communicate with them about that. So we look at a baby, we look at their genitals, their body, and we assign them one of two categories, male or female. And Anne was assigned male at birth, but never felt like a boy, never felt like a man. And then as an adult, Anne transitioned, trans across, and went from being male to female. Anne is a trans woman, Anne is a woman. And then we started saying, well, we can't just say trans and non-trans. What will we call someone who is assigned male at birth and then does feel themselves to be a boy and a man? They literally line up on the same side. So we pulled a word from chemistry, cis, CIS. It literally means on the same side. And we said most people are cisgender. Some people like Anne are transgender. And now we have people coming along going, well, that's all well and good for you, but I'm neither male nor female, cis nor trans. I identify as non-binary. This might be someone who says, who uses they, them as a singular pronoun instead of he, him, or she, her. 20 states, including our own here in Minnesota, allow a third gender option for driver's licenses. That used to be 13. 19 states allow it for state IDs. And millennials now make up over a third of the US workforce, according to Pew. And the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation estimates as many as 12% of millennials may identify as trans or non-binary. So I like to say, I think this is a genie that's not going back in the bottle. I don't think we're going to see a mad rush back toward the binary. Demi Lovato, pretty famous entertainer, just came out a couple of weeks ago as non-binary. I think we're going to continue to see people identify in this way, particularly younger people, but probably slowly older people as well. Even the they, them pronoun, if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary or Webster's, you will see that they, them is now listed in the dictionary as a singular pronoun when it's always been a plural pronoun. I don't think that's because some grammar guru decided, wow, you know, this is a good change. I think it's a change that reflects the change in society. So whatever you think about this, and you can have different opinions about whether it makes any sense to you, but the bottom line is this is a change that's coming and something that we need to be prepared for, I believe. And the third way I want to talk about how we're changing in terms of race is around, or the third way I want to talk about the changing landscape is around the notion of race. You've probably heard the phrase minority white. I like to say majority people of color and Native people. And we will become that kind of nation, majority people of color and Native people in 2045. So that's a ways down the road. That's 24 years down the road. But if you look at children, last year, 2020, was the first year where the majority of kids in America were either kids of color and or Native kids. And for 18 to 29-year-olds, that's going to occur in only 6 years in 2027. Now, I would like to be able to say that this doesn't have to be something with a value attached to it. It doesn't have to be good or bad. It's just a demographic shift. That is certainly the way it makes sense to look at it. But I think it's short-sighted to say that we're going to shift in terms of this, we're going to have this demographic shift coupled with a really seismic shift in our country around our discussion around race and racism and anti-racism. So living here in the Twin Cities, I live off of Lake Street, you know, I identify as white. So what happened around George Floyd and his murder impacted me nowhere near as much as it has BIPOC communities. And yet still, I was just reading where, I mean, just the statistics alone of how much damage was done. And still to this day, we're having another shooting in Uptown, another nights of unrest. New York Times argues that it's quite likely the largest social movement in the history of our country, what happened last summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. So that coupled with this demographic shift, I think is creating some angst on the part of some white people that things are shifting and things are shifting in ways that may not be great for white people. I don't believe that, but I want to put it out there because I think there's evidence of it. I want to share a story to start. I was asked to come speak to a state agency in Minnesota. Now, this is a state agency that has day shifts and night shift work. Most people want day shifts, right? I'd never met anyone on this diversity committee, and we have a perfectly fine conversation. As I'm leaving, an older white man I've never met before comes up to me and says, do you want to know why I'm on the diversity committee? And I say, well, okay, you know, I mean, I was willing to entertain his, you know, talk to him. And he said, I'm on the diversity committee because I'm convinced they're trying to give all of the day shifts to people of color. That's why he's on the diversity committee, because he's worried that they're going to hurt white people, that they're going to give day shifts, the good shifts, to people of color. Now, what could I say to him? I don't know anything about this. I turned to him and I said, well, I will just tell you in my 25 plus years of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I've never once met someone who, a person of color, a Native person whose goal was to put white people on the bottom. I've only ever met people who want things to be fair. But I share the story because I think he's an example of a kind of fear and anxiety on the part of white people. I'm also hearing it in my trainings, people worried that it's going to be literally harder for white men to get jobs. I don't think there's evidence of that. I'll share a couple of kind of surveys they did. This is admittedly a few years ago, but I'd be really surprised if it hasn't, if anything, increased. But this is National Public Radio, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Harvard School of Public Health. They surveyed over 3,400 American adults. and 902 of them were white. And over half of the white respondents said they believe discrimination against white people exists in the US today. Do I think it's possible there could be discrimination toward white people? Of course, it's possible. Do I think there's evidence of it? I don't. I don't think we see widespread problems with racial profiling of white people not being hired, white people not being promoted. There just isn't a lot of evidence of that. In fact, it's when we get into implicit bias, you'll see the evidence is to the contrary. Now, only 19% said that they've been personally discriminated against because they were white. So I don't know exactly what explains the 19 versus 55%, but I wonder if it's, well, it's not really happening to me, but I think it's happening to someone. And I wonder if that's about this demographic shift that is happening. And if you are inclined to think, and this is a kind of ageist assumption, I think, but it happens, people think, well, these are older people who think this way. It's not that. That is not the case. This is from MTV Public Religion Research Institute report, January 2018, poll of 15 to 24-year-olds found that 43% of young white men say discrimination against whites is as serious a problem as discrimination against other groups. Again, I just don't think there's any evidence of that. 29% of young white women say it. Almost half, 48% of young white men believe efforts to increase diversity, now that's what I do every single day, work to increase diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, will harm white people. So by now you can tell I don't believe that, but I share this because there's a way that we want to believe that these issues of race, of gender, of sexual orientation, these social identities, these issues of equity and fairness and oppression don't exist in our organizations. There's some kind of firewall, right, between all of that happening out there and our workplaces, but that's not the case. We bring these issues into the workplace, they play out in our workplace, which means we have to talk about them. We have to be prepared to talk about how pushback around racial equity, for example, is playing out in our workplaces. So before I get into microaggressions, I just want to share this last slide about why equity matters, to remind us that these things are still going on, that there's a tremendous amount of inequity and oppression that still exists. So you probably know that we are seeing an increase in hate crimes. The Southern Poverty Law Center says hate groups in the US are at an all-time high. We've seen a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, in anti-Islamic violence, and anti-LGBTQ violence, and violence toward Black, Indigenous people of color. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, over 3,800 hate crimes against Asian Americans have been reported, with 68% against Asian American women. Just another one, I think, in New York City a few days ago, where a woman was beaten. So these are very real issues that need to be addressed. We are seeing this increase in both organized hate and indiscriminate hate. An Equal Employment Opportunity Commission survey of over 5,200 newly employed workers found Black job seekers were offered significantly less compensation than whites by potential new employers. This is a perfect example of the difference between equity and inclusion and diversity, right? We can have a very diverse workforce. If we don't pay people equitably, it's not enough that it's diverse. Let's take the tech industry. I always think of the tech industry as a place with kind of young, brilliant, woke millennials. They decided to do a survey around gender, found that 40% of the women they surveyed in tech were underpaid compared to their male counterparts, anywhere from 4 to 50%. And even if you're paid well, what is the experience in that workplace? So a 2018 survey found 38% of women, almost 4 in 10, had experienced sexual harassment in their workplace. For some jobs like flight attendant, it goes up to 60%. And a 2020 study found that 72% of those who reported sexual harassment faced some form of retaliation, including termination and denied promotions. A reason that probably we're not seeing as much of this counted or reported as could be. So again, an example of how we might even be compensated well, but if we have to put up with this kind of harassment, that is not equity. And finally, just 2 months ago, the Arkansas legislature passed a law that would ban gender affirming medical treatments for transgender youth. They wanted this so much that they passed the bill. Governor Asa Hutchinson vetoed it, and they overrode his veto. So this is arguably one of the most restrictive transphobic laws ever passed by the state legislature. Literally, if you are the parent of a child who comes out to you as transgender and needs trans-supported services and healthcare. You cannot get it anywhere in your entire state. According to the Human Rights Campaign, the largest LGBTQ organization in the country, in 2021, remember, we're not even 6 months into 2021, 82 anti-trans bills have been introduced in state legislatures, the most number of anti-trans bills ever introduced. So what we're seeing is pushback, right? That as we move forward, we also get people saying, I don't want things to change. I'm freaked out, and pushing back. That's part of the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Again, we need to remember this because it's not like this doesn't seep into our organizations. And one of the ways it seeps in is through micro inequities or microaggressions. Now, why do I have two words for the same concept? So, cheesy joke warning, all my jokes are kind of cheesy and bad. I like to say in Minnesota, we like our aggression with a good dose of passivity, right? Kind of Minnesota nice, passive aggressive. So let's just imagine there's a guy named Harvey. He works in the office, been there a long time. And there's a new young employee, her name's Ann, it's her first job out of college. Every day, Harvey comments on Ann's appearance. Oh, I love your hair, I love that dress. Oh, you look so stylish today, you look so pretty, every day, right? Finally, someone takes him aside and says, Harvey, you gotta knock that off. That's a microaggression, those are microaggressions. You could imagine Harvey might say, what do you mean aggression? I never touched her, I was positive, I was complimentary, right? For some people, aggression is a very loaded word. Like, okay, let's go over and say micro inequity. Same concept, two parts of that word, micro, small. These are not the worst cases of bias, of racism, of misogyny, of sexism, but there's still an inequity, something you say or do, or don't say or don't do, that sends a message. I see you differently. I see you through the lens of a stereotype. Now, why are we talking about microaggressions if clearly we know macroaggressions exist, right? Partly because we don't think these are a big deal. I had a guy come up to me after a training. He said, you know what, Ann? I used to think microaggressions were just a case of millennials whining. And I thought, wow, you managed to weave a microaggression into your very comment. And he said, but I don't think that anymore. And I said, yeah, this is not about being whiny. Oh, you just have thin skin. You need to toughen up. You need to be able to take a joke. You need, right? That's not what this is. These are, first off, things that are cumulative. They add up, and they're often connected to messages that we have gotten our whole lives when we have marginalized identities. So part of why we talk about them is they do matter. I like this website, microaggressions.com, because it's a place that people just come and share their own lived experience and how it made them feel. So I have a few slides after this where I've pulled some from that website. But they say each event, observation, and experience posted is not necessarily particularly striking in and of themselves, right? And often they're never meant to hurt. Acts done with little conscious awareness of their meanings and effects. This is the notion of intent versus impact. A lot of us who do DIA work talk about this. So let's just say that whatever happened between Harvey and Ann makes it up to HR. So HR is like, we got to deal with this. They pull them in, they pull in Harvey first. This is intent. They say, Harvey, what's going on? He goes, oh, I'm so sorry. I never meant anything. I think Ann's the best. I'm so glad she's on our team. She's so smart. You know, I'm just old school. I just was taught that women like it when you compliment them on their appearance. That's all I was doing. But I never meant to be offensive in any way, right? And so here's what happens. We stop there. We go, oh, no malicious intent. Harvey didn't mean anything, right? We can never stop at intent. We got to go to impact. We got to pull Ann in. Now we pull Ann in and we say, what's going on? And she goes, oh, I hate it. Never comments on my work product, my work ethic, how hard I work, my ideas, how smart I am, none of that, right? It's only my appearance. And I grew up in this country, you know, I'm a young woman where the message I got was my appearance was more important than my intellect. So every time I'm around Harvey, I just get reminded of that and I feel kind of yucky. And actually, I just don't want to work with him anymore. Okay, now we're seeing that impact's much different, that the impact is really affecting Ann in ways that Harvey doesn't even understand. So we can never just think about intent. We've got to go to impact, because the slow accumulation during a childhood and over a lifetime of these messages is what defines a marginalized experience. And it can be hard to explain it to someone who doesn't live it. So I want to share these few slides, and then I'm going to put you in your first small group. So a security guard approaches me at an upscale shopping district. I'm the only Black person sitting in the waiting area. I'm waiting for a friend and have been sitting for 2 minutes. The security guard ignores the throng of people around me, comes to me and asks, what is your business here? I'm 31 and in Chicago, and it made me feel like I was nothing. Now, if you take the phrase living while Black and put it into Google, you will see example after example of just this type of thing, where someone who was Black could not do the things that someone like me who has white privilege can do without even thinking. So, of course, the famous case in Starbucks where two men did something I've done many times, just not order something waiting for another person to show up, but the police were called on them. The case of Amy Cooper in Central Park, where she's the one with her dog off leash. A kind Black man kindly asks her to please leash her dog to obey the law. And she calls the police not once, but twice on him, claiming he's threatening her. She ended up losing her job. And even an 8-year-old girl selling water outside her home, like a lot of kids do to make money, has her white neighbor call the police on her. Are you a man or a woman? Repeatedly, everywhere. My boss isn't around the business much. When he does come in, he firmly shakes hands with and looks into the eyes of every male employee. I, a female, am the manager of these male employees, and he asks me to make him a cup of coffee and tells me to smile more. Today at work, there was a Latino father and his children. Like children, they were playing and running around the store. My white boss comes up to me and says, Hispanic people have absolutely no control over their kids. I'm in a pharmacy and need something for a sports injury. When I tell the assistant, she laughs, and so does her colleague. I'm 59 years of age and female. I'm an Asian woman. Whenever there's another Asian woman in my workplace, I inevitably get called by her name multiple times a day. One day, my white colleague told me, you should realize how hard this is for me and stop caring so much, after calling me the other Asian girl's name. Saying I'm trying or you know it's not racist doesn't help when you're not trying and it is racist. What if you accidentally slept with a schizophrenic guy and had another baby, said by a girl at work? I have a relative with schizophrenia and have struggled with depression in the past. Made me feel sad, angry, and like people are always going to judge you and define you by your mental illness. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce those names. My supervisor at a new job about my name. I'd frequently repeated my name in order for coworkers and supervisors to learn it. And my last slide, I mentioned to a coworker that I grew up in a trailer park and she says, but you're so smart. My classmate makes a joke about Jews running the media. We all laugh, including me, because they think there are no Jews around to hear it. Made me feel humiliated. I have no idea how to come out to my colleagues as transgender after I overheard them using transphobic slurs and calling another transgender person an it. I'm a young teacher in a rural area. I felt invisible, humiliated, and hopeless. And finally, pretty much anytime I leave the house in my wheelchair and go to a public place, people feel entitled to come up and ask me the most intrusive personal questions. On a weekly basis, someone asks me, what's wrong with you? People frequently talk over my head to my friends or family members like I am mentally impaired. Many people have told me that they can relate to my disability because they were on crutches for several weeks with a sprained ankle or broken leg. I'm 27 years old and the comments are always the worst in big cities and on public transportation. Makes me feel anxious, frustrated, angry, and sad. So here are the questions I have for you in your first small group discussion. I just want you to talk about, have you ever witnessed or experienced a microaggression or microinequity? I mean, it can be in your context of work, but it doesn't have to be. It can be in any context. And if so, what happened? And also, if you're feeling kind of brave, you can talk about if you've ever committed a microaggression or microinequity. And here's why I say that, because we all will. Like, my goal is not to create this mad rush back towards supervisors or HR. Certainly, if something egregious happens, if there's a pattern, if there's overt harassment, you definitely need to follow up with that. But if you find that a colleague is talking over you in a meeting and that you think it's gender related, FYI, they did a study of the Supreme Court and found that the female justices on the Supreme Court were far more likely to be interrupted than the male justices. So no matter how high up you go in your career, apparently, that dynamic follows you. What we want is to be able to bring each other into conversations, to hold each other accountable in a way. So not just can I say this to my colleague, but if my colleague says it to me, can I not get defensive? Can I not feel so much shame that I shut down? Can I recognize it's actually a gift when someone shares this with me? And can ultimately I change my behavior? So at any rate, have a conversation about that. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to stop the screen share. I'm going to put you into small breakout rooms. I'm just going to give you, give me a minute to set these up. And I'm going to give you about 12 minutes to have that conversation. There'll be a little timer in the corner. I'm just changing one other thing here. And I'll give you a 2-minute warning when there's about 2 minutes left, so that you know to wrap up. But go ahead, turn on your cameras, introduce yourselves, and have a conversation about microaggressions. I'll see you in 12 minutes. Kelsey, do you want to go in or do you want to stay out? You're muted, sorry.
Sorry, there's people sending me messages. So just
Oh, okay. Okay. I don't know if Jean or Jennifer, if you want to go into a group, but I don't, if you're talking to me, you're muted, Kelsey.
muttering to myself.
Oh, okay.
Just
All right.
Trying
Okay,
to find
good.
my group to join. That's all.
Okay, cool. Everyone, welcome back. I hope you had a good conversation. I wanted to see if anyone was willing to share a time they experienced or witnessed a microaggression. If you're feeling like you might want to actually share a time you committed one, feel free. No, I'm not going to push you on that, but I have had people do that. So anyone want to share? Sue.
Well, one of the things that we just talked about in our group was before the meeting started today, I participated in cracking a joke about no men in the room and cracked the joke about how women rule the world. And some of us participated in that. And I just wanted to say that I'm aware of that and I apologize to people because I know that one person in my group was uncomfortable with that. And when I look back, I would have made a different choice. And I don't think any of the men were in the meeting at that point, but I want to apologize to them anyway. And I'm going to try and do better.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I appreciate that. And I just want to make a comment about, and I see that there's some stuff going on in the chat. Feel free to, I'm not very good at being able to navigate the chat while I'm doing this. So feel free to unmute yourself and jump in with some stuff. I did want to say one thing about what you said, Sue, which is that making a statement about a group of people like that can feel in some ways, like even in a joking way, kind of derogatory is painful. What I also want to point out is that I don't believe things like reverse racism or reverse sexism exist. So if I will share, if it was a group of people of color and Native folks who said, there's no white people here, I personally wouldn't feel offended as a white person, because it's a very different thing to say there's no people of color or Native people here than to say there's no white people here, because the power goes in different directions. And I think that's true around sexism, right? So part of why women make jokes about women running the world is that women actually don't run the world, that we know for a fact that women do the majority of work in the world. We know that. And yet overwhelmingly the majority of organization, you know, even in nonprofits, even in libraries and nursing where female dominated, even in vet med, all female dominated fields, you're more likely to see men at the top. So because there's still institutional sexism, and we don't have to agree, it's okay if we disagree. So I can see why that made people uncomfortable. I certainly can, because it might not have been perceived as welcoming. But I do want to say that from a framing of, I don't think it's the same thing to kind of make some jokes sometimes about white people or men or straight people, because I think that, again, the oppression, oppression is, or sexism or racism is when we have bias plus institutional oppression. Does that make sense? But somebody jump in. Pat, I see your hands raised.
I really appreciate you saying that, because the last part of our small group conversation was about what is it we can say, or do we
Yeah.
say anything anymore? Or can we, my comment was, I see myself lately becoming more and more quiet when I was very, very familiar with what Sue said and would have jumped in there right away. And I did. And so, it's figuring out the balance and understanding it. And we're struggling. I personally struggling with that, but I'm glad you said.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, and you're not alone. A lot of people are. Thanks for that. Amanda?
Yeah, I'm probably going to put my foot in my mouth today, because I'm trying to talk, well, not trying to talk more, but trying to really engage in ways that where I might screw up. But if that's where the growth is, then that matters.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. And Sue, you're one of my favorite people, because you're so smart and so connected to others and so in tune with this community. I love men. I love my grandfathers. I love my father. I love my husband. I love my son. But I had a very similar response as you were saying that, of like, you are not the person who needs to be apologizing right now. On the one hand, of course, we don't want to alienate anyone, be they men or colleagues, whomever, but I have reached a threshold of just anger and frustration and exhaustion around some of these things. And I'm sure my white lady, middle-class white lady fatigue and exhaustion probably just barely scratches the surface. But I don't want to hear Sue Hakes apologize in that way. I want to find a way to say, God damn it, I'm angry at sexism, men, whatever. And to say, so these beloved men that I care about and work with, let's work on this together. And you other men who are not beloved because you're jerks and I'm tired of it, quit using your institutional power to be assy to me. I want to be able to dig in on that rather than just, and on a personal level, like I'm trying to stop apologizing as much. I want to take the apology out of certain situations, not other situations. There's a lot of situations where I'm full of apologies and they are sincere and I've screwed up and I want to keep those coming, but not in these institutional context. I just don't feel sorry anymore. Let's fix it.
Thanks, Amanda, for sharing that. Linda.
I just want to say, I think that Sue's apology is a lesson. And I think that whoever's in the room, by hearing Sue's apology, teaches a lesson in a voice. And yes, Sue's a respected leader and a respected communicator. And I look to that as her apology, and drawing the attention to her statement only serves to say, you know what, that could be offensive. So rather than say, Sue, you don't need to apologize, I go, Sue, there you are, being the consummate teacher that you are and the great leader that you are, and lending voice to a statement that could sometimes be offensive. So kudos to you, Sue. That's awesome.
Thanks. I appreciate this conversation. Kelsey, did you just put something? Do you want to share what you just put in the chat?
Yeah, I was just, maybe some of you are not familiar with the concept of fumbling forward. MCN put together a workshop on it, and some of us have attended it. So you might hear us use that language. It's the idea of the fumble forward, which is originated by Donna, and she seeks to promote exchange. The most important concept is saying, I'm fumbling forward when you're talking, instead of sort of, I know sometimes we can do a lot of prefacing things like, I don't really know what I'm talking about, or a lot of things that kind of neutralize the value of what we're trying to say, but instead utilizing this concept of fumbling forward to give room to, we don't necessarily have a fully formed idea, or maybe it's something you're trying to work through, but it isn't negating what you're trying to say.
I like that.
And I
I'm
did a 5-minute summary of it with her support. And I put that link in to hear a little
Oh,
bit more.
thank you.
'Cause she had a lot of good stuff, a lot of good.
Oh, great, wonderful. Yeah,
I just want to say Nina has had her hand up for a couple minutes. We want to,
thank you, Carly, for helping me out because I can't always tell.
no
So
problem.
please do that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to say my name is pronounced Nina. It's a
Nina.
Oh,
trick
I
my mom
apologize.
has played on me. So, but I just wanted to make an observation that diversity, equity, inclusion, and access or accessibility work tends to be a field dominated by women. If it's Estella Mara Ben Simon from USC or Alicia Dowd at Temple University, or even the women who are referenced in chat, they are people of color who dominate the field. And so I think these discussions are unique because they break that cast of the standard narrative, right? And we work more from memory and experience than we do from kind of that traditional canon. So Sue, your apology is really meaningful, but know you are an excellent company.
Yeah, and any other comments? I was going to make one comment, but I want to see if there's any. I don't want to break down any or stop any dialogue. So great example of how we need to have these kind of conversations. And I like the fumble forward. They are messy. They are uncomfortable. I don't know if you saw what just happened at this tech company called Basecamp, where it's a well-regarded tech company. And the two white men who ran it, they were talking a lot about race. And one of them wrote in a blog that it just gets, he didn't even say uncomfortable. He said unpleasant when we talk about these issues. And so they stopped. They said, we can't talk about social or political issues anywhere in Basecamp. And they lost a third of their staff, including even senior leaders who said, this is absurd. What are you talking about? We can't talk about this stuff. So it is sometimes unpleasant. It might be uncomfortable. We might disagree, but we have to fumble forward and have those conversations. And the last thing I just want to say is that part of our work, and I do a lot of work at talking about emotional intelligence, part of our work is to hold on to ourselves when, you know, I have worked and had people of color where I've been brought into a training where I've had people of color and Native people, but who were like, didn't want a white trainer. And I can feel how mad they are that I'm there, right? And it is so tempting for me to say, but wait a minute, I'm one of the good ones, I get it, you know? And my work is to say, where's all that anger coming from? And what is the effect of racism? That's me feeling the edge of racism. So I believe when a man experiences women saying, there's something special about women only space or femme only space, however we define it, or when there's pushback about having men in the room, just like when there's pushback about having white people in the room, that if some of that's painful and uncomfortable, that's people with privilege feeling the edge of racism. That racism brought us there, not people of color, racism. I believe this. Sexism brought us there, not women. So that's just a frame, and that we have to, and it's okay to have feelings and talk about them. And yeah, great discussion, great discussion. I want to move us along just because I have some more content I want to get to, but I love how much you're jumping right into it. I want to talk about, well, implicit bias, but I forgot I had these two slides. So this is just an article from Hannah Yoon in the New York Times that I think is helpful about how to respond to microaggressions. She has these 5 questions to ask yourself when weighing the consequences of responding. So the first 3 are about like kind of weighing how much emotional energy, how, you know, is, and also risk am I willing to take? So if I respond, could my physical safety be in danger? If I respond, will the person become defensive and will this lead to an argument? If I respond, how will this affect my relationship with this person? We get to decide that. I had a woman once who said to me, what should my husband have done? He's sitting at lunch with his boss and his boss's boss, and they're telling F jokes, where by F I mean a word for gay men. She said, what should he have done? Right? We were talking about being an ally. And I said, he gets to keep his job. Like in that moment, there's a huge risk for him if he were to try to have confronted one of the or both of the people at that table. And now hopefully he could go to HR, but still, I mean, some situations are tricky, and we get to, we have to, at the end of the day, to some degree, take care of ourselves. But I also like number 4 and 5. If I don't respond, will I regret not saying something? And if I don't respond, does that convey that I accept the behavior or statement? There's a consultant named Catherine Mattis who does a lot of work around bullying and incivility. And she is pushing to move from using the word bystander to using the word reinforcer, which I really like. She said, and one of the things to think about is how agency shifts in those two words. In bystander, something happens to us. Reinforcer, we have agency, we're acting, we're reinforcing. And what also shifts is moral culpability, right? It's one thing to say, well, I just witnessed something, I didn't have anything to do with it, you can't blame me. It's another to say, I witnessed a racist statement or a sexist statement, I chose not to say anything for whatever reason. And in that way, I conveyed that I accepted the behavior, and in many ways, I reinforced it. And that we can hold ourselves accountable for, and others can hold us accountable as well. So I really like that 5th one there. But these are also just some ways that you can push back or bring people into conversations, not just push back, but open up the conversation. From Diane Goodman, ask for more clarification, separate intent from impact, as we talked about. I know you didn't realize that this was hurtful, but here's what it feels like. And then share your own process, that kind of modeling that I think can be very helpful. So I want to share a little bit now about implicit or unconscious bias. University of Washington calls it unexamined. Again, why are we talking about this when we know explicit bias exists? Partly because we don't think we show this. We think we're a good judge of character. We are good at making hiring decisions. We likely don't think that we show racial bias or gender bias or bias against people who are LGBTQ or have disabilities, and yet the research shows we all do. So it's unintentional, automatic, outside of our awareness, and contradicting to our conscious beliefs. It's not about what we consciously believe, it's literally how our brain works. So I want to share a TED Talk from Kristen Pressner. She's the global head of HR at Roche Diagnostics. And so it has a slight corporate feel, honestly. But what I like about it is how she talks about her own coming to realize she has bias against herself as a woman leader. And also this notion of flip it to test it, which I think is actually very helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and share that. And if for any reason you cannot hear this video, please let me know. It's about 9 minutes long.
Okay, so let me just get this out there. I have a bias against women leaders. No one could be more surprised about this than me. I'm a woman leader. And on top, I even work in human resources, which means it's kind of my job to be unbiased. In fact, I passionately encourage women to step into leadership. My poor kids would definitely tell you I never stop talking about it. But in spite of my strong belief that women make great leaders, I've realized I don't always act like it. Not long ago, within the same week, 2 members of my team asked me to take a look at their compensation. My first reaction to the man's request was something like, yeah, I'll look into it. My first reaction to the woman's request was something like, I'm pretty sure you're good. A day or so later, I'm sitting at my desk, hard at work, and I somehow connected what, up until then, I'd seen as 2 separate events. I'd had 2 very different reactions to basically the same request, and I thought, what's up with that? Might I be biased and not even know it? But I know what you're thinking. This is 2016. It's not a topic. Women leaders are everywhere. Maybe you, like me, have personally hired or promoted lots of women leaders. But then I thought, with all this talk of unconscious bias, might something be going on that I'm not even aware of, if it's unconscious and all? For those of you who might not already have been inundated with this in the corporate world, it's a simple concept, and it's backed up by neuroscience. Our brain has to handle way too much information. So in order to manage it all, our brain takes the liberty of looking for patterns and filtering for us what it sees as the most important bits, like autopilot. Our brains take shortcuts. Without these shortcuts, we'd have to sit and really think through way too much information. Imagine if every single time you had to think through everything from how to open doors to how to shake hands to how to sing happy birthday. But brain shortcuts do have a downside because they see patterns that are based on the cumulative effect of everything you've been exposed to throughout your life, which means the whole thing is happening also in the back of our minds, which means we're not even aware that it's happening. This can cause us to behave in ways that are not true to who we want to be or how we feel we are, and we might not even know it. Unconscious bias sounds kind of clinical, but I looked it up, and other words for unconscious are comatose, paralyzed, or senseless. And other words for bias are bigotry, intolerance, and unfairness. Okay, so that would mean we're not just unconsciously biased, we're actually senseless, intolerant bigots. So that's not something I want to be, consciously or unconsciously. And here's the scary part. Most of us think we can outsmart it. We believe it when we say things like, I don't see race, or I just hired the best person. It just so happened that at the time of the 2 pay requests, I was doing research on unconscious bias. And the research said, these are our expectations of men. We expect them to be assertive and strong and driven. And these are our expectations of women. We expect women to be helpful and sensitive and supportive. If we were to make it a little bit tighter, we see men as taking charge and women as taking care. No, it's not because every single one of us is a misogynist. It's simply because men taking charge and women taking care is what we've mostly been exposed to throughout our lives. And our brains will do the rest, unconsciously redirecting us into those patterns that it recognizes. Still feeling like this bias couldn't possibly belong to me, one of the words jumped out at me. Wait a minute. Do I see the man as a provider, and so I looked at his pay request more seriously? And do I not see the woman as a provider, and so I've somehow dismissed her request? In that moment, I had to realize I do. I see men as providers, but not women, which is really interesting because I'm the sole financial provider for my family of 6. My husband is a stay-at-home father for our 4 children. I take charge, and he takes care. I'm the last person I could imagine who could ever have a bias against women leaders, and yet I had to realize I have a bias against women leaders. I have a bias against myself. And if you're thinking, wow, bad on her, unfortunately, I'm not the only one with this bias. The research shows that we all have a bias against women leaders. We just don't know it. I had both a man and a woman ask me for a raise at the same time, so I was confronted with my different reactions real time. And I could notice it when I was accidentally treating people differently. Luckily, that happened, and I realized in time, but how many times have I not caught myself? How many times have you not caught yourself? So what's the antidote to being a senseless, intolerant bigot toward women leaders or anyone else? It's a big stretch to imagine that we'll always have the opportunity to cross-check our reactions with 2 different people in real life. But I've realized we don't need to. We can do this comparison mentally, and it's just as eye-opening. Just mentally flip whoever you're dealing with for someone else to test yourself. Like here. I made a slight change to this slide. I flipped the photos. Does anything on this slide feel weird? Flip it to test it. If it feels weird, you might want to check yourself. The more I tried it, the more I saw the value. In fact, there's this Twitter account that just flips the gender of things we commonly say, and suddenly they become funny. Being called a policewoman doesn't bother me at all because I know it covers both women and men. Andrew, policewoman, age 40. Or let's take my hometown baseball team of the Cleveland Indians. Flip it to test it. How would you feel to be up in the stands cheering for the Cleveland Caucasians? Now, maybe you're thinking, this doesn't happen to me. And maybe you're right. Maybe you are a superhuman person who manages to intercept those brain shortcuts at exactly the right moment to ensure you're behaving bias-free and consistently with your values and beliefs in all of your actions. It could very well be. But what have you got to lose to double check yourself? If we all started to flip it to test it, we might just be surprised at how often we would choose to behave differently. Because what if you're missing an opportunity to see the world differently? Thank you.
So I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. I want to share kind of quickly just a little bit about what we know about implicit bias. These are some resources for you. There's the Harvard Implicit Association Test, or IAT. It's under Project Implicit. You can go online and take it free of charge. You can take it around race, around religion. I happen to take the one around gender. And sure enough, I showed a pro-male and anti-female bias. I moved to Minnesota to study feminist philosophy. So just proof that this is not about your conscious beliefs. If there was one place I would point you to, it'd be the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity out of Ohio State. They do a tremendous amount of work gathering all the research, the social science data that exists. There's the Haas Institute, Perception Institute, and a great book by Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a social psychologist. I want to just share a little bit about what the research looks like. So this is an example of the kind of research that's out there. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? They take absolutely identical resumes, no difference, just the name. In a US context, the names Emily and Greg are kind of stereotypically associated with white people, while Lakeisha and Jamal more likely to be stereotypically associated with Black or African Americans. And then they send the resumes out. And what you see is the resume with white names had 50% more callbacks. And there are many other studies, including those dealing with housing, healthcare, online sales, perceptions of risk and safety, that demonstrate that people of all racial identities demonstrate a pro-white and anti-Black bias. So some people think implicit bias is a bias towards your own group. It's not, it's a bias toward the group with social, political, and economic power. So while Black, Indigenous, people of color don't show as much of this bias, they still also show pro-white and anti-Black bias. Now, if what you take from this slide is, wow, those lawyers are really biased, you'll be kind of missing my point. I think this is something you could recreate in other areas. But Nextian, a consulting firm, decided to do this exercise. They took 60 partners from 22 law firms, and they gave them a memo to read with 22 mistakes in it. They just told half of them they were reading something written by a white man, the other half something written by a Black man. In both cases, the name of the man was Thomas Meyer. And what you see is how this piece of writing was perceived really did have something to do with race. The reviewers gave the memo supposedly written by a white man a rating of 4.1 out of 5, while they gave the memo supposedly written by a Black man a rating of 3.2 out of 5. The white Thomas Meyer was praised for his potential and good analytical skills, while the Black Thomas Meyer was criticized as average at best and needing a lot of work. Remember, they're reading exactly the same thing. Reviewers found an average of 2.9 out of 7 spelling and grammar errors in the memo by the white Thomas Meyer, twice as many, 5.8 out of 7 errors in the memo by the African-American Thomas Meyer. And I want to make an important point here that we tend to focus on how stereotypes function negatively. And in some respects we should, because they're profoundly hurtful. The stereotype that we are not going to see the Black Thomas Meyer as competent, as he's not praised for his potential and good analytical skills, but criticized as average at best and needing a lot of work. This is wrong, it's hurtful, it's discriminatory, right? It's biased, but we forget that stereotypes also happen positively, that we literally see things positively when we shouldn't. That's the stereotype. And the part that really kind of when I read this initially, the thing that jumped out at me was they literally don't find the mistakes the white man made, right? That they only found 2.9 out of 7 spelling errors, likely because they didn't think they would be there. But they thought they'd be there for the Black man, so they found them. And so what this shows is that between the negative stereotype and assuming competence, assuming a level of skill that might not actually be there, assuming that literally not seeing the mistakes that the white man makes, is another way that this bias really functions to impede our work, really, right? We're not seeing people for all of their skills, and we're also assuming skills and competence that might not actually be there on the part of people with privilege. This is an example of the kind of research that's out there around gender. Here they take science faculty. These are people we typically think of as like, objective and smart, and they send them applications for a lab manager position. The only difference in the application is a name, male or female. And they said, who would you hire? Who would you mentor? Who would you give more money to? And in all the cases, both male and female professors rated male applicants more competent, more hireable, more suitable for mentoring, and offered males higher salaries. So as with race-focused research, people of all gender identities demonstrate a pro-male and anti-female bias. Not as much research out there around sexual orientation, but this is an example of one they did where now the names on the resumes are the same, but one references a gay campus organization and one a more generic campus organization. And what you see is the study revealed a bias against the candidate that was perceived to be gay. And then this is a literature review, attitudes toward individuals with disabilities as measured by that Harvard IAT or implicit association test. Across all studies, implicit bias was evidence against people with disabilities. So you might have a disability yourself, have someone in your family, care deeply about disability issues and disability justice, you're still going to show this. Again, to Kristen Pressner's point, it's literally the shortcuts that our brains take. So we know there are microaggressions. We know there's implicit bias. What do we do about it? Well, we want to show up as an ally, a champion, an advocate, a co-conspirator, accomplice. There's always a new word. I think it's not so much the word as the concept. To me, the concept is that whatever your lived experience, whatever your social identities, and whatever role you play in any given organization, you can choose every day to be someone who's willing to pay attention to, and most importantly, take action around the social, economic, and political differences and inequities that attend to people around these social identities. A few quick things about being an ally. Most of us are a complex mix of marginalized and privileged identities. And the whole point is not to feel bad about who you are. Allies move past shame, guilt, and blame. When we feel guilty about being white or guilty about, being heterosexual or cisgender or male, we just center it back on us instead of saying, okay, that's who I am. That's where I start. But don't judge me on where I start. Judge me on where I end up, right? What am I going to do with the privilege that I do have? And I think anyone can become an ally, but you really do need to pay attention to your own social identities and how you move in the world. And it's really an ongoing process. It's about self-reflection, an openness to new ideas, a willingness to really listen to and believe other people's lived experiences, especially when they're different from our own, a commitment to ongoing education, and a willingness to take action and to some degree take risks. So before we move into the scenarios, this is another video. It's short, only 3 minutes. Dr. Joy DeGruy, some of you might know about her. She does a lot of work around the effects of slavery on the Black family. She has a whole theory called post-traumatic slave syndrome. I've seen her speak twice. She's an amazing speaker. In this short clip, she's just talking about going to the grocery store and what it means to be an ally. So I'll go ahead and show you that.
My sister-in-law, who's half Black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her you know, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, you know, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up, and says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, you know, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It's totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day. And she used her white privilege.
Oh, sorry about that, everybody.
Make right a situation.
There we go. So we're going to move into talking about scenarios, and I'm going to share one story before I move into the scenarios that came from me showing this video clip. Actually, I had shown it at a small liberal arts college outside of the Twin Cities, and the community where this college is located is overwhelmingly white. And I had just shown the video, and an older white man who's a faculty member stood up and he asked a really good question. I was training faculty, and he said, you know, this is great, but these 2 women know each other, they're family. What if like something happened and I witnessed something and I was to jump in? Might I be seen as like this white savior? I mean, it's a very good question. And before I could even answer, the chief diversity officer for the college, who's a black man, stood up and he said, I want to tell you a story. Said, I live in this community, it's overwhelmingly white. It's rare that I'm around many people of color, but I went into a store, a gas station every day, I get my coffee. Said a couple days ago, I go in, it's all filled with white people. I noticed the young woman behind the counter, she knows me. And, you know, we exchange hellos. And I'm standing in line and a white woman I've never met butts right in front of me, just cuts right in front of me. And he said, it was so obvious. And I try to engage her, she won't engage me. I look around, I can tell that people have seen what happened, but nobody says anything, right? I can tell the young woman behind the counter sees it. And these are his words. He said, I wanted to go off on her. I wanted to just be like, what do you think you're doing? This is so unfair. But he said, you know, I looked around, I'm a black man, I'm the only person of color. All I need is for one person to call the police, and it could be deadly for me. I just can't risk that, right? So he said, I just kind of shoved it down and stayed in line. And as she's leaving, she turns to him. and says, "You should have moved." So it was like salt in his wound. He gets up to the counter and the young woman says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I should have said something." He said, "Don't worry about it." He gets back. He said, "I went in my car, I called a friend," right? But he said, "I'm telling you this story because I needed one person to say one thing. I needed one white person to recognize they had privilege, that even if she had gotten mad at them as a white person and someone had called the police, they weren't likely to lose their lives, right? That they moved in the world differently than I did, and that they could use their white privilege to interrupt something." But he said, too often you all wait, you don't say anything. You want to get it perfect. You don't want to be the white savior. And he said, in that moment, I'm going to push you to not always worry about getting it right. This is the fumble forward. I really like that. I clearly will start using that and want to reference who it comes from. To fumble forward and take and put yourself out there to stop some things or interrupt it, or just send a message, "I see what happened and it wasn't fair." So now I share that story when I show this. But here are your two scenarios, and then I'm going to put you back into groups, different groups. Scenario one, you and a few colleagues are talking informally. The conversation turns to past jobs and the supervisors you've all had. You all agree that most manager supervisors have been okay, but there are always a few that are particularly challenging. One of your colleagues, Daniel, who identifies as a person of color, shares how he was treated differently by a particular group of managers in his last job. Daniel says, "It was so frustrating because they would listen to the white employees more than me, even when we were saying exactly the same thing. And I even felt it from some of the younger managers. It was subtle, but I noticed, of course. Sometimes the racism just gets really hard to deal with." Most of your colleagues are silent, but one colleague, Denise, who identifies as white, says, "That sounds hard. I've had managers who don't listen to me either. I'm not sure it's always about race, though. Sometimes they're busy or stressed out or just jerks, you know. I usually try to remember it's about them and let it roll off my back. I also think having a positive attitude can help a lot." So that's your first scenario. Your second one is this. You have a good relationship with a new staff member, Louise. You and Louise are talking about work when Louise says, "Can I ask you a question?" When you say sure, she continues, "Well, I don't want to sound biased or anything, but what's with Trey? Yesterday, he introduced himself saying he identified as non-binary and used they, them pronouns." Louise continues, "Since when is this a thing? I mean, they isn't even a real pronoun. Well, not for a single person. Of course, I want to be respectful, but isn't some of this diversity stuff just getting out of hand?" Laughing a bit, Louise says, "I didn't think I'd need a gender studies degree for this job." So I put these both into a work setting. You can put them in any setting that works for you. But here are your questions. What would you say if you wanted to address the issue and reframe the conversation? What would it look like to be an ally, an advocate, a co-conspirator in the situation? How might your own social identities, like your race or gender, et cetera, affect how you would respond and how you might be perceived? And how might your role within your organization affect how you would respond and how you might be perceived? So that's why I wanted you, stop the screen share. That's why I want you to have that document that's in the chat so that you can reference these when I put you in small groups. I'm going to go back and make the groups a little bit larger and give you again about 12 minutes. And I'll see you when you come back. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good conversation. Did anyone choose to talk about that first scenario? What you might do? Any thoughts?
I would just love to share that I shared this in the small group, and John made a really good point. John, I hope it's okay if I share that. Okay. That I like, my first instinct as trying to be an ally as a white person was to deal with Denise. Like, I wanted to like talk to her, deal with her, like, let's have a talk. And John made a really good point as a person of color that there's like first this idea of validating that person of color's experience. And that was so good for me to be reminded of, to not move into fix it mode, which is super easy for me, and start with validating the experiences of what was just shared and what that must have been like before trying to fix it. So that was really important for me to be reminded of.
Great. Thanks, Carly and John, for absolutely really, really important point. And I want to thank Kelsey for all she's been doing, putting stuff in the chat, and also to point out that someone pointed out, I don't always see if you've got your hand raised. So please also feel free to say, hey, someone has their hand raised, or just jump in. I will make one comment about how powerful it can be to turn to someone who is sharing with you their lived experience of, in this case, racism, and just validate it. Because part of what happens with marginalized people with marginalized identities, whether it's around like racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, biphobia, transphobia, is there's often this sense of, is it really racism, right? So if Carly says, Anne, how are you doing? And I say, I'm having a hard day. Carly doesn't say, are you really, Anne? Prove that to me, right? You take it at face value. So it's really important in this case, I think, to say to Daniel, I'm sorry you experienced racism. We're not going to debate whether you experienced, I trust you, I believe you. And say, I'm sorry you experienced racism. And if like Daniel works in my organization, to say, I hope you never experience racism here, but if you do, because it happens everywhere, I hope you know I would support you in any way you might need. And you don't have to even know Daniel that much to say that, right? That could be powerful. And if Daniel wants to share more, great. And if Daniel doesn't, that's fine too, right? And then to maybe try to engage Denise, which I want to point out, Denise may appreciate and she may not. Because never judge your ally efforts by whether someone changes, because you have no control over what anyone else does. We desperately want to believe we do, but we actually don't, right? That's emotional intelligence. Judge your ally efforts by, did I speak my truth? Did I push through my fear? Did I try to hold someone in relationship while I did this? And did I do my best? And I already checked out the website of the person who does Fumble Forward. I just love that idea of like interrupting things to say, I don't know that I'm going to get this right, but I'm going to try some, and I want to attempt something, right? One thing, yeah, Amanda.
I would add to that too, as a, in an effort to be an ally, not expecting the person I'm trying to be an ally to like where I'm to not expect the gold star, the like, great, let's go out for drinks now, like to have no expectations around that. Obviously, if that person says that is not how I want your allyship, change it. But that
exactly,
that just adds to the exhaustion and fatigue of people who are trying to serve as allies too.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yep.
And can I throw in one more thing that was
please
awesome? In that same conversation, I was in there with Carly and John and well, I won't name the whole group, but we were talking, and one of the cool things that was also said was about expressing when you do turn to Denise to talk about, sort of let's maybe let's have this conversation, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to learn, as a white person hearing from a person of color that they've experienced racism, this is an opportunity to learn too. And, thank you, Daniel, for sharing your experience. And for us as white people, we can learn from it. And that was pretty a nice idea.
Yeah, I like that. And also modeling, I know for me, if someone said, hey, Anne, you just really messed up, sit down, I'm going to tell you what you did wrong, as opposed to, if you're willing, I'd like to share with you some ideas I have that I've learned because I make similar mistakes. I'm much more likely to hear that, right? This is from one person with privilege to another. Can I share? So, when you say, I don't think it's about race, I might be inclined to say, I don't think white people are going to know if it's about race. Like if you all at CCHE said, and we want to find out if there's any homophobia, we're going to survey all the straight people. I'd be like, really? That's like I wouldn't do that. I'd survey everyone really. But the people on the receiving end are the ones who really understand the dynamic. So to kind of point out to Denise that, and also the idea that, and part of why I wrote the scenario, as you can tell, is that Denise means well. This is not malicious racism. This is her trying to help, but she's really not being helpful. She's minimizing the experience. And so, that's often what we see as well. It's not kind of malicious. There is hatred, but in the workplace, it's less likely to be that than someone trying to be helpful.
I
How
think to
about,
go
oh no,
off
jump
of,
in.
to go off of that, and to go off of what Lena said, we really had such a great group in that conversation of when after the validation and dealing with Denise, we had this discussion of like, where can you relate to her and call her in. Lena mentioned this thing we've talked about at CCHE a lot, this concept of calling in versus calling out, like getting
Right.
people into the conversation versus calling them out and making them feel defensive. So maybe there's this way to relate as someone who identifies as a female, like someone in our group said, she has probably had her own experiences as a woman feeling discriminated and was trying to relate. And so as a woman,
Right.
I could say, I hear you. I've had some of those too. But in this situation, I think maybe we should have focused on Daniel or whatever, like finding those
Right.
connection points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we can stay in relationship with people, we're much more likely to move them, right? And in the process, move ourselves as well. How about Louise? Did you talk about what you might do with Louise? That's my mother-in-law, delightful woman, but I needed a name, so I pulled her name. And she's like, she doesn't quite get it, right? You probably noticed I had her misgender Trey in her very comment, right? Did you talk about what you might say? Because now she's asking you directly. Somebody from a different group talk about it at all? Or no offense, that's a great group, but I just was gonna pull in another group. Did you talk about it or no? You did.
We did in our group.
Yeah.
And we all felt that it was important to confront it with Louise. And we had kind of like 3 different similar responses. And like one person's response was just kind of be just really blunt and be like, hey, this is what this person prefers. And this is the pronouns that they are not preferred, that this is the pronouns
Right.
that they want you to use. And we should be respectful of that. And then like one of the responses that I had said was, it'd be really awkward if I joke that my name gets mispronounced all the time. People call me Andrea and there's no N in my name. It'd be really awkward if a coworker kept calling me Andrea over and over and over again,
right,
and refused to actually call me by the correct name. How is it really any different using the pronouns that somebody wants you to be using?
Right.
And then one of the things that I thought was helpful too was throwing a little bit of empathy in there. And we had a conversation about that, about how it's kind of like that muscle memory too for your brain when it's someone in your life that you're used to calling by a certain pronoun or by a certain name. When someone changes their name, it can be challenging for your brain to adapt to having to refer to them with their new name. But we all agreed that we still need to make every attempt to work on that muscle memory in our brain to be calling the person by the name that they have now chosen to be called.
Right.
So those were kind of the things that we chatted about.
Right.
Yeah. If anybody in the group wants to throw in some more stuff that I may have missed.
I once had I've done this, numerous times, and I had a couple of times where someone said, well, Louise just needs to go talk to Trey. And I'm like, nope, this is not Trey's issue, to be really clear about that, right? Trey doesn't have to do a gender 101 every time someone doesn't understand their pronoun uses. I do think Louise deserves support, but that would be more from HR or her supervisor should be able to talk to her about what's going on. And maybe you can be supportive too and say, I don't think you need a gender studies degree. And I don't think we're going too far. This is just about being inclusive. And I love, Adria, your point about, as someone whose name gets mispronounced, I know it's off-putting. It doesn't make me feel listened to, or whatever your feelings are about. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this does impact me. So I can imagine it would impact Trey to hear pronouns that are not the right pronouns for them. I am aware of time, and I want to show, so I want to be respectful of time, and I want to take just a couple more minutes if that's okay, because I want to share 2 more slides real quick with you. The first is Dr. Makini King is a psychologist out of Kansas City. And I love this kind of daily practice she talks about. So I'm just going to read that. And then I want to just read the next slide and then send you off to lunch or on your way. Here's a thought experiment I encourage you to make a part of your daily habit. As you move throughout your day, sit in a classroom, a department meeting, a social space, or as you go to the supermarket, to your neighborhood and residence, or visit with your friends and family, I want you to think about the inequality that might exist in that space. This may not initially be an easy task, and I think this next part is really important. We tend to make the assumption that if we feel a space is safe, inclusive, and pleasant, then everyone must feel the same way. I want you to think about what the experience might be like for people who represent marginalized or non-privileged communities. For example, people of color, non-Christians, immigrants, people experiencing homelessness, women, LGBTQIA people, indigenous people, people with disabilities, people with low income, or people for which English is not their first language. Consider who's represented in that space and who is not, and then ask why. Then consider who has a voice that is being heard in the space and who does not, and then ask why. And then ask yourself how you might act as an ally in order to support those people who may or may not be represented or who may or may not have a voice in order to actively make the space more equitable. And so the last exercise, which we don't have time for, but I wanna, the next steps piece is about kind of asking you to think about what you can do personally to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. And in many ways, these next questions are exactly what we're gonna be doing in the afternoon. So consider what you can do to help advance diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility at Cook County Higher Education, and what can Cook County Higher Education do to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. I'm just going to share that you'll get the PowerPoint. That's my contact if you ever want to kind of reach out to me and have any questions. But I would say that question about what can CCHE do moving forward is exactly what we're going to be addressing. So I'm encouraging you to think about it as we move in. If you're not going to be able to share the afternoon with us, and I certainly understand why, I would encourage you, if you have a minute, if you have any thoughts about that, to put it in the chat, just so that we can, any kind of thoughts you have about what you would like to see CCHE do to continue to move forward. And really the goal is to get CCHE to be a leader around diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility in Cook County, but really across the state and across the country. So as we wrap up, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us. I hope to see a number of you back here this afternoon. We understand that if you can't, we certainly understand. But again, you could send that, put that in the email, in the chat, or also feel free to send us an email, right? To any of the Karen or Kelsey or Carly or Adria or Lena, anybody, or if you're connected to a board member, Sue, or any other board member that you might want to reach out to. So thanks very much. And we will be back in this link in an hour after lunch to start in on our strategic planning process. And Paula, I knew I was Sue and Paula, the 2 board members I've been working with. Apologies, Paula. Reach out to them as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see some of you in an hour.